Hello, entrepreneurs. Joe DiChiara, an entrepreneur with a CPA license, coming to you for the first ever podcast episode of How to Win Big at Business. And I am happy to be bringing this to you. And let me start off by telling you what my purpose is for this podcast. You see, I've been an entrepreneur, an official entrepreneur, since I was 10 years old. And I've learned a thing or two about what it's like being in business, which is, to put it bluntly, it could be a very scary experience. It could also be one of the greatest moves that you have ever made in your life. So it's truly a roller coaster. And the truth is, no matter where you are on your journey, it's always going to be a roller coaster. The richest man in the world, Elon Musk, still has bad days. So if you think that if you only had enough money, things will be fine, you're truly mistaken. But let's stay on track here. And the purpose of this podcast is to inform, educate, and enlighten business owners about all the obstacles, potholes, roadblocks that are going to come up. It's not if they come up, it's when they come up. And it's my job to prepare you so that when it happens, you're not in shock. You're not totally surprised. You're not saying, oh my God, what did I do? Am I ever going to get out of this? And believe me, we've all gone through that. Any successful entrepreneur will gladly share with you their failures, or like Napoleon Hill likes to call it, temporary defeats, because you're not really done unless you quit. And if you quit, that's fine, because obviously, if you're ready to quit, then being in business is not for you. It's not for everyone. It's not for everyone. So I'm going to take you through my journey, other people's journeys, and also share with you a lot of the nuggets, the practical items that successful entrepreneurs put into place. And there's a lot of them. And it's not like there's any secret sauce. Nobody has the right recipe for success. The truth is that true success comes in a number of ways. You can mix and match it. And really, in a nutshell, what I could tell you after, you know, being an accountant for 40 years, starting my first entrepreneurial journey when I was 10 years old, I held a casino in my driveway at 10 years old. And I'll get into that story because it is part of my story. Over the 40 years of being an accountant, I have worked literally with thousands and thousands of individuals, all shapes and sizes, rich, poor, just, barely making it, doing well, and everything and everyone in between. People that have dealt with tragedies, losing a child, going bankrupt, losing everything, and still came out on top. And in all of that time, the one true ingredient, the one thing that every successful, I mean truly successful entrepreneur has, is self-awareness. So it always starts with you. I just did a podcast with a guy, and I love this podcast because it was all about really, the same type of topic. He talked to entrepreneurs about their journey, and he asked me, the first question was, so how do people market their business? How do they make money? And I shared with him, my number one advice to business owners is find what you do that you love. Find what you're passionate about and turn it into a business. I don't care if it's gardening. There's ways to make money. There was an individual with a YouTube channel that taught people how to crochet, and he had a lot of followers. He was making a lot of money. Now, it might be folklore, but I don't think so because I've seen people. I saw there was a guy when I first started in accounting. I was at a really good CPA firm. I got a really good foundation in what accounting really was. And one of the senior accountants was talking about a client that he was just put in charge of. The guy sold rags. The guy literally sold rags. I don't know who to, I don't know where he got them from, but I remember the senior partner looking at the financials and he's like, how could his gross profit margin be 97%? And Kirk, the accountant, looked at him and he said, the guy sells rags. He gets them for practically nothing and does something. I don't know what he did with them, but the guy was making a fortune. It doesn't matter what you're passionate about. You can make money with it. So that's the first lesson. If you go into business with the purpose of making money and you make a lot of money, let me tell you what's going to happen. You're going to make a lot of money and then you're going to want to make more money. And when you make more money, you're going to want even more money because you're going into it under the premise that, oh, if I just make a lot of money, I'll be happy. When I my first accounting practice, what I did was I specialized in solving tax problems. And before that, I'll get into, the four different kinds of accounting practices that I've had. Because yeah, even people put CPAs in a box with the impression, oh, he's a CPA, he does taxes. Wrong, wrong. So, you don't always want to judge a book by its cover. And that's why I start out introducing myself as an entrepreneur with the CPA license. And I'm going to get into my story in this episode because it's important that you know who I am and why I'm qualified to share this with you. And I'll share with you not only in this episode but many episodes a lot of my failures, or like Napoleon Hill likes to call them, temporary defeats. So I'm early in my career and I'm handling at the time, probably, yeah, my entire career, a gentleman that was very wealthy, was worth over $10 million, owned, restaurants, buildings in Manhattan, real entrepreneur, came to the United States from Italy with nothing, rags to riches story, and to this day, probably one of the most miserable people that I ever met in my life. The guy could have wrote a check literally for $1 million and it would clear. So not many people could do that. Even people that are multimillionaires, they don't have the cash. They don't have the, liquid funds, but he did. His children couldn't stand him. They couldn't wait for him to leave this earth, and so that they can divvy up all his money. And unfortunately, when at the end he did get sick, he had cancer, he passed away, and one of the first things they did was they fired me, as if the things that he did, the way he ran his business was partly my fault. Nothing was further from the truth. And at the same time, I had another client. It was a couple. It was just a once a year individual income tax return, and they lived from week to week. The wife had some kind of disability, so she couldn't work. They had three young boys. He made maybe $50,000 a year. And if you live on Long Island, even though this was 1985, No, wait, not 19. It was about 1992, let's say. $50,000 a year with the family on Long Island, you're not really doing that well. And every year they would owe the IRS money because when you're living week to week, you don't have enough taxes taken out. You got to put food on the table. And they would come in every year happy, laughing, and I'll never forget this. They would come in and say, "Oh, let's see how much we're going to have to owe the IRS this year." And it was a constant payment plan. And I looked at those two situations, the guy with all the money and this family that was living from week to week. They were happy. And it made me think, I said, you know what? I guess it's true. Money really doesn't buy happiness. And that stuck with me for a long time because everyone wants to be happy for the most part. They might not know how to be happy, and that's for another type of podcast, a mental wellness podcast, which my friend Vincent Lancy actually has a podcast on mental wellness. Anyway, it intrigued me. So I said, how do you become rich? Because who doesn't want to be rich and happy at the same time? Not many people that are broke are really happy because it's a struggle. When you're struggling through life, things happen, people get sick, you can't pay your rent or you can't pay your mortgage, the car breaks down, you can't fix it. So where is that happy medium? So where, I'm doing what I love, I'm making more than enough money to live. I'm saving money. I'm also helping people because that's another part of the equation. Where is that happy medium? So I went on a journey of self-discovery because I needed to know. And I'll take you through that journey. But one of the stops was reading a book called The Science of Getting Rich by Wallace Wattles. And in that book, he challenges people. He says, listen, if you do what I tell you to do in this book and you don't become rich, well, then you're proof that my theory doesn't work. And I took him up on the challenge. I said, you know what? What do I got to lose? Uh, I was never rich. I did well, never doing as well as I thought I could be. But most importantly, no matter how well I was doing, it was not enough. And believe me, I had achieved a lot of my goals that I had set out to do. I became a CPA. I had a wife, three beautiful children. I had a house. And I remember when I opened my first office, sitting at my desk, thinking, I've arrived. This is it. This is what I always dreamed of. I'm my own boss. I have my own business. The sky's the limit. And that lasted for about 2 minutes because my next thought was, oh my God, I have to pay office rent now. I never had to pay office rent. And I needed equipment. I needed computers. I needed a bookshelf. I needed all this stuff. And then, I realized, I said, I got a lot of work to do. Now I needed to hire somebody. I couldn't do all the work myself. And that's, where the real entrepreneurial journey started. So let me go back to, my story. I shared with you when I was 10 years old, I ran a casino. It was a one time thing because my parents were like, they're like, hey, Joey, that's great. But we don't want you running any more casinos in our driveway. Uh, so the way that happened was a few weeks earlier, all of my friends from the neighborhood, we had put on a carnival. And I don't know, I don't remember whose idea it was, but it was a carnival to raise money for muscular dystrophy. Now, I love that because Jerry Lewis, if you don't know who Jerry Lewis was, he was a comedian. He was my favorite comedian. When I was growing up, every year he would have a muscular dystrophy telethon. It was a 24-hour telethon, and they would have all kinds of celebrities, singers, uh, everything. So it was entertaining. I'll never forget sitting in front of the TV. Every year I would wait for it. It was like my favorite show of the year. And people would call in, and again, they had the telephone banks. You would see people answering the phones. And what I learned was that people were calling in to donate money for these children that really tugged at my heart. You know, the kids in wheelchairs, and Jerry Lewis was he put his heart and soul into helping these children to help find the cure for muscular dystrophy. And every year my mother would let me call up and donate $1. So, I'm 7, 8 years old and I'm calling up imagining, oh, that person's answering the phone. And, I was able to donate $1. And that was like, oh my God, I'm helping people. I'm supporting my favorite comedian. So when the neighborhood kids said, hey, let's put on a telethon, not a a carnival to raise money, it was awesome. I'll never forget it. We planned it. We marketed it. We used to at the time, we built go-karts, just wooden go-karts. And we would ride all through the neighborhood, pushing each other in the go-kart, announcing the carnival. And then on, some Saturday and during the summer, we put on the carnival, and it was awesome. We lived in a dead end with a big circle, so we had all the stations set up, and there were games. You could win prizes, and me and my best friend Angelo, our job was to push kids down the street and back in the go-kart. I think we charged them a quarter or something, but at the end of the day, we made over $100. Now in 1970, that was a lot, for 10, 9, 10. I think the oldest kid in our crowd might have been 13 or 14. And so it was a huge success. Now, top that off by my friend's father, who owned a business. He owned a trucking business. And what he did, he said, whatever you raise, I'll match. So that $100 became $200. Now you could imagine I went from, giving Jerry $1, and now we're sending him $200. And it was like, you could hear in my voice, I still feel it. So a couple of weeks later, I was so, happy. I wanted to do it again. So I said, look, I'll set up all these games. I'll charge admission. I charge admission, and I told, a bunch of people in my neighborhood. They came, everybody had a great time, and I walked away with like $3, which at that time, that's like a fortune for a 10-year-old in 1970. And I'll never forget asking my mother. I said, Mom, why do people get jobs when they can just start a business doing what they love? And she said, I don't know, Joey, but you'll find out. You'll find out. And so what stuck in my mind was, how much fun I had doing it. It was easy. And the fact that my friend's father owned a business and had enough money to double what we made. So I was like, business people are successful. I want to be in business. Now, also, what I realized, probably recently, thinking back, what made me an entrepreneur? What made me think that I could actually do stuff? And it was my mother, because I grew up watching her do all kinds of entrepreneurial things, making jewelry, selling it, Tupperware parties. She did everything under the sun to make money. Flea markets, selling toys. She's an entrepreneur. Even to this day, you can go online, Suzuki.com. She has an Etsy store, and she still makes crafts. and she sells them Christmas ornaments. So uh, that kind of artsy talent runs in my family. I didn't get that. Uh, so how did I become a CPA? Well, from 10 to let's say 17, I just like my mom, I was always doing stuff to make money. Paper route. I didn't have one paper route, I had two. I would do one in the morning and then before school, and then another one when I came home from school. And I would save money and raking leaves if it was the fall. In the winter, I was shoveling snow. In the summer, I was mowing lawns, always doing something. Okay. And what happened was, the kids that I had grown up with, let's just say they started doing stuff that they shouldn't be doing. They started getting into trouble. A couple of them started stealing cars. And, my father saw this. Some of them started getting arrested. And these were the people that I grew up with. And I remember my grandmother one time looking out the window because four of my best friends had come to pick me up, and she looked out the door and she's like, I don't like the kids that you're hanging out with because they're wearing leather jackets, they're listening to Black Sabbath, and I didn't get the point at the time. Like, Grandma, those are my friends. I grew up with them. Bobby, Cypher. And what she told me was, what somebody said, you're the sum, basically, I'll paraphrase, you're basically the sum of the people you surround yourself with. And when I learned that, I said, oh, that's what my grandmother was saying. She wasn't saying like she didn't really like those kids. She said, I don't like the kids you're hanging out with. In other words, she saw me, and this was another thing in my family. I grew up in a big, close Italian family, and I remember they they said, Joey, you can do anything you want. My father said you could become the president of the United States if you want. And then later on, I remember I found out how much he made. At the time, it was like 200,000 a year. And I was like, why would I want to be president? They don't even pay that well. Okay. So this was my upbringing. So I'm 17. I start getting into trouble. I actually got arrested for assault twice because I was getting into a lot of fights. And my father saw this. And I had always planned on going to college, and that was another thing. None of the people that I hung out with, none of the people I grew up with had any plans of going to college. In fact, by the time I was 17, going on 18, a lot of my best friends had quit school. They just quit school. And so this is, my father's looking at this and probably saying to himself, if this kid doesn't get his stuff together, he's going to wind up in jail. So we're at a family picnic, and I'll never forget. He points to one of the guys and he says, you see that guy over there? He's a CPA. And I was like, that's great, Dad. What's a CPA? And what he told me was that CPAs run businesses. Not only that, other business owners go to them for advice. And I'll never forget, it was July 1977 because I was still, no, actually, it was June. My birthday's June 22nd. So it was June. We're at the park. I'm not 18 yet. And so I said, that's great, Dad. I said, I'm going to be a CPA then. Not knowing really what a CPA did. What I knew was that they ran businesses and other businesses went to them for advice. Perfect. I'm going to be a CPA. So, I graduate high school. I wasn't a good student, so I didn't have grades to really go into a good school. So I enrolled in a community college majoring in accounting. And, I became a good student in college because I wanted to be successful. And from there, I got straight A's. I got really good grades. That enabled me to get out of my neighborhood, which I do. And I went to a school, SUNY Oswego, which was as far away from my old friends as I can get. Uh, Great experience. Finished my accounting career, got an accounting job, but something interesting happened in between graduation and the summer before I graduated. And again, it's something that shaped me, basically, indirectly led me to this podcast and what I do today. And I'm going to get into that because I didn't mention the business that I'm running right now, which is Bedrock 360 Business Solutions. We're in the middle of rebranding, and I'll tell you all about that. But so what happened was now I'm about to graduate. It's the summer. It was this. I left school. The semester was over. I come home and I'm like, okay, now I'm going to prove to the world that I know how to run a business, a real business, not mowing lawns, not doing that. And I had driven an ice cream truck uh, the year before, and it was more like Cheech and Chong's Nice Dreams. It wasn't a business. It was just, instead of getting a job in a factory like all of my other friends, I was like, I'm an entrepreneur, but I didn't run it like a business. I ran it like a college student, just making money to have fun, pay for my car. But this time I said, you know what? I'm going to be serious about this. I mapped out a route. I leased an ice cream truck from a really legitimate ice cream company. They made me sign documents. I saved everything. I'm like, because I'm a businessman now. You gotta run it like a business. And I kept records. How much did I make? How much did I spend on gas? What was the weather like? And I look back now, I'm like, that was probably the best business I ever had. It was simple. I was a hero. I was a hero because think about it. You got people running after you. Stop, stop. I want to give you money. And it was fun. And I was like, who's got it better than me? I'm making my own hours. Going to the beach to sell ice cream. I can go home whenever I want. But I was running a business now, so it was serious. So summer's over. I made a lot of cash, for me at the time, college student. What expenses do I have? And just my car and what it cost me to eat and drink, obviously, at my college. I had also another part of my story is I had joined a fraternity, but I'll get into that because it's still a big part of my life. Anyway, I graduate and I'm like, okay, now I'm ready to rule the world. I proved that I can be an entrepreneur. I made money. Now, the sky's the limit. So I get my first CPA position. Okay, I'm about 4 months into my job, and I get a letter with a big red stamp on the front that said warrant, tax warrant, and I'll never forget it. Actually, it wasn't on the front. I'm sorry, they can't do that. It was a letter from New York State. I open it up. That's where the big red stamp was. Tax warrant. Never forget it. It still sends chills down my spine. Anyway, it what it was, it said tax warrant. I had no idea what that meant, but it scared the living daylights out of me. I didn't sleep for 3 days, and I thought my life was over. I'm like, I'm going to get fired. Do I have to hire an attorney? These are the things that actually went through my mind. So on the third day, I remember it was a Friday, getting close to the end of the day, and I went up to one of the accountants. So I'm working in a CPA firm now, right? And I get a tax notice, and I don't know what to do. So I walk up to Bill. I said, Bill, can you help me out with something? And I showed him the letter. I said, what do I do? Am I in big trouble? And he looked at me and he said, why don't you call the number on the letter and see what they want? So I did that. And lo and behold, all it was one of the papers that I signed was to register as a sales tax vendor. And they wanted a return. I didn't owe any taxes. There was no sales tax I wasn't required to collect any sales tax because I was selling ice cream. But in order to lease the ice cream truck, this was one of the things that the company required me to do. I don't know why, but I did it. And luckily, I had saved all the paperwork because I was running a business. And when I called them, they said, "Oh, this is what you got to do to fix it. Just send in." They they issued me a certificate of authority. It was like a postcard size thing. And they said, send in a return, no tax due, check off the box, out of business. It was a temporary business, and mail it in. No harm, no foul. I didn't owe any money. There was no penalty. And I said, "Oh my God, I got away with it, you know." But what stuck with me was the total fear. Here I was thinking, "Oh, this was easy. It was too easy. It was too easy. It was easy to make money. It was easy to run a business." And that letter shattered everything. It for 3 days, I was a shell. I canceled my travel plans. I was going to go visit my grandparents. I said, "Listen, I got this tax thing I got to take care of, and I'm not going to be able to come." I wound up going because, like I said, it turned out to be nothing. But that was the first experience I had that made me realize that maybe business wasn't as easy as I thought it was. And then over the years, I saw the same thing happening to other business owners. People get into business, they don't know what they're getting into, and they hit that inevitable wall, that obstacle. And when fear sets in, nothing good happens. So that's what this podcast is about. Eliminating that fear, explaining to people, listen, this is normal. Elon Musk hits obstacles every single day, multiple obstacles. If you think that you're going to become successful and everything's going to be hunky dory, it's just not like that. Business is tough when you start it, when you hire your first employee, when you get to 10 employees. Here's the truth. Let me give you some broad statistics. Right now, there's over 33 million businesses in the United States. 30 million of them are solopreneurs. Most of them are being taxed as sole proprietors, which is the absolute worst way to do business. And there's a reason for that. When I came across that statistic about 7 years ago, I was in shock. I was in shock because being a student of business, I had done all kinds of research. I've been on the SBA website. I was studying the numbers from the SBA before there was an internet. And I always knew, okay, this is the amount of businesses there are. This is how many small businesses there are. And, doing market research, where are these businesses? Who's running them? So I knew how many businesses there were. But there was a term called non-employer firm. That's what they called them. So being a CPA in the CPA world, anybody that had a business, we set them up as an S corp because that was a better way to do business. If they came to us as a sole proprietor, we would set them up with the corporation, and that's how we did business. That's what I learned, and I was like, that's how everybody, does business. Little did I know that most business owners don't hire a CPA. And the reason being, because now I know, is because we're expensive. It costs money to hire a CPA. And I like to say entrepreneurs are delusional, myself included. We think, hey, I could fix cars, so I'm going to start my own repair shop. I can cook, and this is one of the worst. I can cook, so I'll open up a restaurant. Restaurants are one of the hardest businesses in the world to run. So just because you can cook doesn't mean you can run a restaurant. In fact, the successful restaurant owners usually don't cook. They hire a cook. They hire the cook. So if you think anything that I'm telling you is off, that I'm wrong, just go out there and do your own research. Talk to accountants, talk to other business owners, but believe you me, these are facts. And how do I know? Because after 40 years of being in the accounting and business world, dealing with thousands of individuals, I've seen it all. I've seen every situation that you could possibly see. There's no more new situations. They might be different people, different circumstances, but when you boil it all down, it comes down to people that are enthusiastic about something and they think that they could just start a business and be successful. Maybe people want to be free from the 9 to 5. Okay. Maybe they're doing it out of necessity. They need to have a second job or a second business. Now they call it the gig economy, right? They go into business and they look at it and they say, you know what? I'll hire an accountant when they start making money. That's where the delusional part comes in. Because the truth is that most startup businesses fail. Most people that start businesses, and I've seen this, a lot of people start businesses and never make a single sale. They're delusional. And believe me, I've started businesses like that myself, even after I had 20 years of experience in accounting. So you might say, oh, you're an accountant, you should know. Well, I listen, that's why I'm an entrepreneur first. I'm an entrepreneur with the CPA license, and that's the truth. That's the truth. So, when I come across these numbers, now I'm like, why is this? Why do people stay as a sole proprietor? It doesn't make any sense. Sole proprietors are overtaxed. What they don't realize is they're paying 15.3% in they call it self-employment tax on their net profit. That means that a sole proprietor that makes, let's say, $20,000 is going to pay over $3,000 just in Social Security tax. No income tax. No, I mean, and it depends on the year and the tax bracket, but that's before income tax. Now, I've seen plenty of businesses that are actually operating below the poverty level. Think about this. A family that the breadwinner is running a business making a $50,000 profit. I had the example of my client making $50,000 with 3 children. There's a lot of people out there. There's a lot of businesses that are barely surviving, can barely pay their bills. So a $50,000 net profit will cost $7,500 in self-employment tax. So think about it. $50,000 for a family of three, let's say four, you're close to the poverty level. You can't afford to pay rent. You can't afford a nice car, but it is what it is. And for them to pay 7,500 just in self-employment taxes it's a tragedy that doesn't have to happen because S corporations don't pay Social Security tax on their net profit. And, there's a whole thing about, oh, well, if you have a profit, you have to take a salary and now you're paying Social Security taxes anyway. That's an argument for a whole nother podcast. But the bottom line is most business owners aren't rich and successful. Most business owners are barely breaking even, struggling to survive. A lot of them stay in business despite the fact that they don't even have a viable business. And they're getting hammered. They're getting hammered by the government. by all the compliance, all the rules, sales tax, payroll taxes, all these things that get them into trouble. And they get into trouble because they didn't hire an accountant, somebody that's knowledgeable enough to guide them, to keep their taxes to a minimum. And I understand why. It's hard to justify hiring an accountant that's going to, in New York State, I'll give you an example. I asked my cousin, and we're going to wrap this up in a minute because I've gone on way too long, but this is important. I asked my cousin, I said, "Hey, cuz, I love you, but I think it would be better for our relationship if you found somebody else to do your accounting, because I have some family members I don't actually talk to anymore because of their taxes." But that's another story. So she went out, and now her business doesn't get any easier. She's a social worker. She's a therapist. Okay. She has two clients, two insurance companies. They send her, one payment each a month. So there's two deposits. She's got herself on salary, and she's got, regular recurring expenses, her car, her cell phone. So it doesn't get any easier from an accounting standpoint. There's no sales tax. It's simple. The CPA she went to talk to wanted $9,000 a year. And that's basically the going rate. It costs a lot of money to run an accounting firm on Long Island. Okay. But no matter where you are in the country, somebody with a CPA license, even an enrolled agent, even a bookkeeper, we're expensive, relatively speaking. So when somebody goes into business, they don't know what they don't know until it's too late. Most times when we get a new client, a lot of times it's because they've gotten into trouble or they reach the point where they say, you know what, I'm paying way too much in taxes. I don't know what I can actually write off. I'm making some money now. Maybe it's time that I hire an accountant. A lot of times they haven't filed returns. A lot of times they set up their company the wrong way. They set up an LLC when they should be a corporation. And again, I'm going to go through that in another podcast, another episode. So that's the story. It's starting a business. It could be one of the greatest things you ever do, and it could be one of the worst things you ever did. Okay. And that's what the show is about. The show isn't about, solving all the problems that you're going to come into if you start a business. The show is about educating you about what to expect, how to deal with it, how to compress your time. Because here's another thing. Once you start a business, you're out of time. You're out of time. There's 100 things to do, and they're all a top priority. So how do you manage that time? That's another thing we're going to cover. Time management, tax minimization, marketing, work processes, standard operating procedures. How do you hire people? How do you stay out of trouble? How do you stay under the radar? If you get audited, what are you supposed to do? What are books and records, and how do I keep them? All of these topics we're going to cover. On top of that, I'm going to have world-class guests, people that have been there, done that. You're gonna hear from millionaires that have been broke several times. So that wraps up episode number 1 of How to Win Big at Business. I am your host, Joe DiChiara, CPA / entrepreneur, and also the founder of Bedrock360 Business Solutions. You can visit us at www.bedrock360businesssolutions.com. And that's my story. I'm sticking with it. Over and out. God bless, and I'll see you in episode 2. Thank you.